Hey everyone! Tonight, we're diving into something incredibly relatable: sleep, or more specifically, how people in the medieval era slept, which turns out to be far stranger than most of us imagine. But before we get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy the content. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey back before electricity. Tick-tock. Medieval approaches to nighttime, influenced by sleep habits and hygiene, followed a schedule that would baffle today's melatonin enthusiasts. This was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep pattern split almost like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was straightforward. After sunset, most people went to bed early, entering what was called the first sleep. After roughly 4 hours, they would wake up intentionally and spend the next hour or two engaged in what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was simply the natural rhythm of sleep. The wakeful period between the two sleeps was practical, often productive, and sometimes surprisingly social. During this time, people would pray, read religious texts, tend fires, or check on livestock, because nothing ruins your REM cycle like worrying about a wandering goat. And yes, this period was also regarded as ideal for intimacy. Medieval doctors and marriage manuals suggested the body was rested and the mind calm during this time, which is a polite way of saying couples were too tired to argue. So, if you thought waking up early to make your partner coffee was romantic, remember your ancestors were setting the bar quite differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. This nightly rhythm was common for everyone, from monks to farmers, and even literary figures like Chaucer casually referenced it. So yes, even medieval literature had people complaining about not sleeping properly. Interestingly, modern science suggests that segmented sleep may actually be a more natural pattern for humans. The two-phase sleep cycle aligns closely with our circadian rhythms when artificial light is absent. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't stress. Just whisper to yourself, "The watch has begun," and tend to a symbolic fireplace. It wasn't until the industrial era, with factories, gas lamps, and the growing obsession with productivity, that society started insisting on 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, as if sleep were some kind of timed competition. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a sign of failure. It was simply the schedule, and everyone followed it, willingly or not. Now, let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. Today, we fuss over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and cloud-like mattresses. In medieval Europe, a bed was usually just a pile of once-living materials, flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken grievances. For peasants, the standard bed was a straw mattress called a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a rough sack, if they were lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, it was just straw spread on the floor, sometimes damp, and sometimes already claimed by a cat. Pallets weren't comfortable, but they were better than nothing. Straw was cheap, abundant, and provided decent insulation against the cold. But it also harbored insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, making sleep a delicate exercise in stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you shifted slightly and hoped for the best. Families with a bit more wealth, or at least functional backs, might place the straw mattress on a wooden frame. This didn't drastically improve comfort, but did reduce the risk of waking up with beetles in your ear. Sheets and linens were rare luxuries. Most people slept in the clothes they had worn all day. Pajamas didn't exist, and personal space was almost non-existent. Entire families, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents, would share the same sleeping area, sometimes even the same straw mattress. If you got too warm, you could always roll over into your cousin's elbow. Nobles, of course, had proper beds, large wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to keep out drafts, and hopefully the lice. These beds were so prized they were often passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. For most medieval people, that was the pinnacle of comfort. For the average person, a bed wasn't about luxury. It was a place to avoid freezing, dodge wandering chickens, and perhaps, just perhaps, dream of being wealthy enough to one day sleep somewhere that didn't squawk or rustle all night. Today, we think of a nightcap as a cozy drink, maybe whiskey by a warm fire, paired with a questionable decision. In the Middle Ages, however, a nightcap was quite literal, a hat. A real, tangible, often comically shaped piece of fabric designed to keep your head warm while you slept. Insulation wasn't exactly a strong point of medieval buildings. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment did little against the cold. Central heating? That was left to the family dog. Since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people turned to the humble nightcap. These came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic style was long and pointed, something you might expect a wizard who also worked as a chimney sweep to wear. They were made of wool, linen, or whatever scraps of warmth could be spared without angering the household goat. For men, nightcaps were purely practical. For women, they could serve as a full head covering, maintaining modesty and hiding hair that might not have been washed since last Lent. Beyond warmth, nightcaps carried social meaning. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, even while sleeping. Caps could be embroidered or dyed to signal a family's wealth or status, because nothing says prestige quite like going to bed with a tiny flag on your head. In urban areas, wearing a nightcap could even indicate being off-duty. Opening your door in one was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for company. Please go away." Nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were long, loose tunics worn for warmth and modesty. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the ghostly moral lessons. Sleepwear in the medieval world wasn't glamorous. It was practical, scratchy, and occasionally fire-prone. Today, sharing a bed with a stranger usually only happens on red-eye flights, ambitious camping trips, or some bizarre Airbnb mix-up. In medieval Europe, however, it was completely normal and hardly optional. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. A bed was a rare luxury, and when you asked for a place to sleep, you didn't get a private room or even a clean floor. You got a spot in a bed that was already occupied. Medieval inns functioned more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy wasn't expected. If there was room in the bed, you shared it, often with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or sport a suspicious number of boils. This wasn't considered rude, it was simply efficient. Beds could hold dozens of people, depending on their size and the innkeeper's tolerance. In larger towns, you might find dormitory-style halls lined with rows of beds, with absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were an everyday competition, and elbow territory was fiercely guarded. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to organize by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, but often it was a chaotic, first-come, first-sprawled affair. Although this sounds horrifying to modern germaphobes, it was still better than sleeping outdoors among wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant uprising worried about theft. Travelers often slept with purses tied to their belts or hidden under their clothes. Others used their bundles as pillows and makeshift security systems. If someone touched your bag, you probably woke up poorer. Nobles, of course, avoided such risks entirely. They traveled with entourages, camped in relative comfort, or demanded private rooms if the innkeeper valued their roof. Going to bed in medieval times wasn't just about pulling up a blanket. It was a spiritual act and a nightly gamble where the stakes included your eternal soul. Sleep wasn't simply rest. It was preparation for the possibility of death. That's why bedtime prayers were essential. Forget lavender sprays or calming playlists. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and rituals designed to cleanse the soul before drifting off. Just in case someone died somewhere between good night and dawn, the logic was simple. Death could strike at any moment. Illness, fire, demons, or most frighteningly, simply being over 30 in the year 1247. So you better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying, and showing up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled was the last thing you wanted. A common bedtime prayer went something like, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Basically, it was a legally minded note penned by a 7-year-old acknowledging that death was a likely bedtime outcome. Adults, of course, had a far more extensive repertoire. Prayers for guilt, prayers for when they suspected the devil lurked in the rafters, prayers for plague prevention, which, unfortunately, didn't age well. Some even prayed to specific saints tasked with guarding sleepers, essentially acting like holy bouncers for your soul. The particularly devout, monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. Afterward, they often took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard since everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly terrified of the dark. Children were encouraged to pray too, partly for their souls and partly to keep them busy instead of questioning why the dog had climbed into their bed again. Parents reminded them angels were watching, not quite the cuddly guardian angels we imagine today, but more like celestial surveillance cameras. In short, priestly prayers were less about calm and comfort and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it as medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are often dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain filing paperwork in the dark. In the medieval world, dreams were taken deadly seriously. They were considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or even that odd relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations. Either way, they demanded attention. Write them down, confess them, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spend a startling amount of time analyzing and interpreting dreams. Entire books were devoted to interpreting dreams. Dreaming of fire might signal hell, water could symbolize purification or drowning. And if you dreamed of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, well, you'd better call a priest immediately and maybe consider moving. Medieval people believed dreams mattered because the soul remained active during sleep, meaning actions in dreams could reveal hidden sins or spiritual vulnerabilities. That slightly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread? It could be your subconscious confessing guilt over real-world gluttony, or just plain hunger. Either way, medieval people were encouraged to confess it, just to be safe. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were even celebrated for holy visions during sleep, while others were quietly advised to eat fewer onions before bed. Dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles, they were prime storytelling material. Medieval literature is full of sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting verses on virtue. In many ways, dreams were the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and far fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, remained wary. Not all dreams were divine. Some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. Dreaming of something unwholesome could indicate a soul under attack, or simply that you slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. In modern times, some people let pets sleep in their beds for comfort. In the Middle Ages, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a cute personal choice. It was a survival strategy. Medieval homes were rarely built for comfort. Stone walls, zero insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating? That was usually the family pig in peasant homes. Humans and livestock often shared the same room, or even the same bed, and very frequently, the same pile of straw. Chickens roamed freely, dogs curled at your feet, pigs snorted beside the hearth. If you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This arrangement wasn't about affection. Medieval people valued their animals, sure, but mostly for practical reasons. Animals produced body heat. They were warm, reliable, and, unlike some relatives, never hogged the blankets. A large dog could save your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner could raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like nothing short of a miracle. Medieval homes, especially those of lower classes, often consisted of a single room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes even dying. Humans and animals shared the same cramped space. Children might be tucked between parents and a goat, while a chicken served as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. Wealthier families didn't usually live like this. Nobles generally avoided sleeping alongside livestock, though lapdogs in bed were common, not for warmth, but as fashion statements and, occasionally, a convenient way to redistribute fleas. Some castles even provided separate sleeping quarters for favorite animals, because nothing says power quite like a dog with its own room and title. Of course, there were downsides. Animals are noisy, they wander, and historically speaking, they're not exactly known for respecting personal space. Medieval humans adapted. Getting hoofed in the face at 3 a.m. was simply part of the nightly routine. If you thought sharing a room at a modern youth hostel was crowded, welcome to the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort quietly died under a vow of silence. Monasteries had little use for personal space, softness, or fun. A typical dormitory housed dozens of monks in a single large room, often arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. Beds, if they could be called that, were usually wooden planks, sometimes topped with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or it happened to be a feast day. Monks slept fully clothed, not for modesty, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was far more painful than simply going to bed already prepared. Their monastic robes, belts, and sandals doubled as both spiritual armor and insulation, though the insulation was poor. If you were cold, you layered up. If you were hot, well, you suffered. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and no talking. Silence wasn't a suggestion. It was strictly enforced under the rule of Saint Benedict. Roll over and groan too loudly, and you might be assigned chamber duty for a week. Snoring was a gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates would. Lighting was minimal, adding another layer of discomfort to the monastic sleep experience. One candle was all you needed. Often you didn't even need to see. The goal was simple: lie still and avoid sin. Despite the austerity, monks viewed their Spartan sleeping arrangements as training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey. Sleep wasn't a pleasure, it was a necessity, tightly monitored and scheduled like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting upright, avoiding any hint of luxury, dreams, or even proper circulation. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem indulgent. At least the pig didn't judge you. Now consider something that would shock most modern sleepers. Waking voluntarily at 2 a.m., not for the bathroom, not for a doom scroll, but for prayer. Loud, cold, candlelit prayer was standard practice in medieval monasteries. Monks and nuns adhered to a strict daily routine based on the canonical hours, beginning with matins, the first service of the day. By day, we mean the darkest hours of the night, when even the owls were deciding whether to stir. A bell would toll, often rung by the unlucky soul who drew the short straw, and the entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived monks would shuffle off to the chapel in silence. Still fully clothed, of course, monks didn't wear pajamas, and the only layering system they practiced was spiritual. In the chapel, under flickering candlelight and the echoing stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scripture, and try not to collapse from exhaustion. Falling asleep during prayer was a real problem. Records show monks punished for dozing during matins, often with extra chores or more prayers. Sleep through matins? Congratulations, you've earned spiritual consequences. Matins could last an hour or more, and some particularly rigorous orders stretched it to 2. Imagine staying spiritually engaged while your stomach reminded you that dinner had been a simple bowl of lentils, and your body was actively shutting down. After the service, Monks either returned to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter orders, moved directly into study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on just 4 hours of broken rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first, quiet hours of the night to God, uninterrupted by daylight, warmth, or even REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion. Once you got past the numb feet and the stinging candle smoke and ignored Brother Ambrose off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a mark of independence, peace, or control over the blanket. In the medieval world, however, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or even unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Beds weren't exactly warm. Stone walls and open chimneys did little to trap heat, and central heating was still centuries away. People shared beds for body heat, not intimacy. Children slept with siblings, parents, and occasionally visiting neighbors, like a sleepover you didn't ask to attend. Beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for communal sleep. Many believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul was vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby acted as a moral buffer. If something went wrong, someone could witness it or catch the demon first. For children, sleeping alone was practically unthinkable. The night teemed with ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits. Tales warned that solitary sleep could invite mischief or spiritual peril, and unlike modern bedtime stories, these didn't end in hugs. They ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy wasn't a concept, it was a myth. Two adults sleeping alone in a large bed? That was either wasteful or, in religious eyes, deeply suspicious. Even monks slept communally. If someone was assigned a solitary bed, it was usually as punishment. Medieval logic: solitary sleep equals opportunity for sin. Group sleep equals public accountability. So next time you're curled up alone with your own blanket in a quiet room, enjoy it. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin sharing the space with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally nodded off sitting upright in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a sense of regret. In the Middle Ages, however, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate lifestyle choice. Certain medieval people, particularly the wealthy or deeply devout, preferred to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none particularly restful. First, medical beliefs of the time suggested lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, and the balance of the bodily humors. In a world where a sneeze could supposedly rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Sleeping upright was thought to prevent brain congestion, which mostly meant avoiding drowning in your own phlegm. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat resembled the posture of the dead. Sleeping that way might confuse God, or worse, draw the attention of the angel of death. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest was also the community's health advisor, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept semi-reclined, supported by bolsters, pillows, or wooden headboard contraptions, medieval versions of a lazy boy. Nobles sometimes had beds with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting meat pies or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks in stricter orders took it further, sleeping upright on benches or leaning against cold stone walls, using only a hood to muffle discomfort. It wasn't about comfort, it was about discipline. Too much comfort could lead to dreams, dreams could lead to sin, and sin meant confession at 5 a.m. Rest quality? Secondary. Virtue, discomfort, and slightly confusing theology came first. Forget goblins under the bed. Medieval sleepers faced real nightly monsters: fleas, lice, and the bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Hygiene wasn't a strong suit in medieval Europe. Baths were rare, laundry expensive, and soap sometimes made from ingredients best left unnamed. Combine that with straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional chicken wandering underfoot, and you had a perfect all-you-can-eat buffet for pests. Fleas and lice were so common, they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily, but nobles weren't immune either. Even with satin sheets and feather beds, the wealthy still contended with these pests. Some rich households employed dedicated nitpickers, actual servants whose job was to comb lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine having the job title master of the royal scalp. Bedbugs were the silent assassins of medieval sleep, hiding in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even cracks in stone walls. They emerged at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you've ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, pest defense was part of the reason. Protection strategies ranged from mildly effective to downright bizarre. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel insects. Others tucked garlic, onions, or even ashes into the bed, a method that did little for the bugs but certainly discouraged any romantic intentions. It wasn't just physical discomfort. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of mankind's fall and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, others strangely romantic. Nothing says, "I love you," quite like, "Let us be united," like the flea that bites us both. While modern sleep is disturbed by buzzing phones or streetlights, medieval sleep was interrupted by scratching, twitching, and the unnerving sensation of something crawling across your skin, because it probably was. And then there was armor. Have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Most people didn't, but some did. Sleeping in armor, while hot, heavy, and loud, was sometimes a necessity. During wartime or in hostile territory, partial armor was considered a safety precaution. A soldier on campaign might only remove his helmet and gauntlets, leaving the mail shirt or breastplate on, just in case enemies staged a midnight raid. There's nothing quite like waking to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips in a besieged castle. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives scattered about, and chamber pots waiting to be tragically overturned. In one curious twist, rumors circulated of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether exaggerated or not, the fear of these nocturnal daredevils led to barred windows and even theological debates about whether one could sin while unconscious. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers simply muttered or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone wandered into a church while asleep, locals might interpret it as a divine sign, or insist on a cleansing ritual, just to cover all spiritual bases. Medieval life, in many ways, taught people how to sleep through chaos. Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, and the occasional siege. These were the ambient noises of the time, the medieval version of white noise. Church bells, in particular, marked every sacred moment. Sunrise prayers, meals, and the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams were probably accompanied by the regular tolling, which eventually your brain just accepted. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying, no weather apps or insulated windows to buffer the noise. Every clap of thunder felt like the world might end. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, chimneys howled like banshees. Still, people slept. Work didn't pause for insomnia, nor did plowing, praying, or running from Vikings. Invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always bedtime deal-breakers either. In the 14th century, people slept through famine, war, and even the Black Death. Death carts rolling through town were grim wake-up calls, not necessarily reasons to panic. And if someone didn't wake up, some considered it a mercy. There are records of people sleeping through earthquakes, bonfires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, but bodies adapted. A day spent from sunup to sundown, barely surviving while dodging taxes, labor, and spiritual peril, guaranteed a hard, deep sleep. For some, sleep also served as an escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or the looming fear of the world ending, which seemed to happen roughly every century, sleep offered the only relief. Some people simply curled up under a cloak, muttered a quick prayer, and drifted off to sleep. There's a strange wisdom in that simplicity. In the winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, was wrapped in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet, creeping fear that seeped into timber-framed homes and across frozen fields. The villagers were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were creating a holy community in the wilderness, a city upon a hill, watched over by God and stalked by Satan. Life was harsh. Salem had recently split from Salem town over political and religious disputes. Crops had failed, smallpox had ravaged nearby settlements, and wars with native tribes left many traumatized. Frictions simmered between neighbors, inheritance disputes festered, and outsiders, or anyone who didn't fit in, were met with suspicion. Add to this the long, bitter, dark New England winter, and it was only a matter of time before something snapped. That breaking point came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began acting strangely. They screamed uncontrollably, threw objects, twisted their bodies into unnatural shapes, and sometimes fell silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. Neighbors whispered that they were bewitched. The girls claimed invisible forces pinched and bit them. Reverend Parris, unsure how to respond, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. Griggs, finding no physical ailment, delivered a diagnosis that would ignite Salem's fears: witchcraft. That single word ignited a powder keg of paranoia in a village already primed to believe in the devil's presence. If the devil could invade the minister's household, what hope was there for the rest of the community? Encouraged by adults and peers, the girls began naming alleged witches. Initially, they targeted women on society's fringes, social misfits and outcasts. But soon, accusations reached the respectable, the wealthy, even the devout. Salem was small, but the repercussions would extend far beyond its borders. What began as whispered fears in the dark escalated into cries from the gallows, leaving a legacy of paranoia that still shadows America's history. Once the notion of witchcraft took hold in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then gradually suffocating everything in its path. It began with the afflicted girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis grew bolder each day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed to see dark spirits hovering over certain households. This wasn't mere childhood fantasy. Their performances were public, theatrical, and most terrifyingly, widely believed. The first accused were those with the least social protection, women living on society's margins. Sarah Good, a homeless baker, muttered to herself when turned away from doors, smoked a pipe, and snapped at children. Her eccentricities made her an easy target. Sarah Osborne, too, drew suspicion. She hadn't attended church in over a year and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. Any woman who defied social norms instantly became suspect. Even Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, was targeted. Exotic, from Barbados, her storytelling and accent frightened villagers. Under immense pressure, possibly even physical coercion, she confessed to witchcraft. Rather than quieting fears, her confession ignited them. Tituba described a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, urging her to sign a book. She spoke of strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, spectral dogs. Most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed. Once the door was opened, accusations poured in. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges disguised as righteous indictments. Property disputes transformed into claims of spectral assaults. If a cow died suddenly, witchcraft was blamed. If a baby cried during prayer, surely the devil was at work. The fear became so pervasive that even the innocent stayed silent, for speaking in defense of the accused invited suspicion. Silence was safety, and as the web of accusations widened, logic and reason faded. Hysteria took over, and the village of Salem spiraled into a fever pitch of paranoia and terror. The colonial government eventually intervened. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and determined to restore order, established a special court to address the chaos. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, French for to hear and determine. In practice, however, it became a factory of fear-driven justice. The court convened in Salem town in June 1692, but it was no ordinary tribunal. Rules were warped by panic. Instead of requiring solid evidence or reliable witnesses, the court allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. This meant that testimony claiming a spirit or specter of the accused had harmed a victim was admissible. In other words, if someone insisted they had seen your ghost choking them in a dream, that counted in court. It didn't matter if the accused was asleep at church or miles away. Their spirit was deemed capable of committing evil. Cross-examining a dream was impossible, and disproving it, even more so. Children became star witnesses. Their fits, screams, and gasps grew increasingly theatrical. Mary Walcott, for example, would convulse the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If the accused looked at her, she shrieked. If they looked away, she screamed even louder. Judges, including influential figures like Judge Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all. Defense lawyers did not exist in colonial trials. The accused stood alone. Denying the charges led to the girls' escalating displays of agony. Confessing could spare your life, but only if you implicated others. The system rewarded lies and punished silence. The trials were public spectacles. People traveled from neighboring towns to watch the accused paraded in shackles, often bewildered, poor, and powerless. Not everyone believed in the proceedings. Some whispered that the girls were faking, others questioned why only certain types of people were targeted. But speaking out was dangerous. Questioning the court meant questioning God's will in Salem. Reason had fled. The law reflected fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. Bridget Bishop was no stranger to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore bright red clothing, ran a tavern, and had previously faced accusations of witchcraft. During her trial, neighbors claimed her spirit pinched them at night, that babies died after she passed by, and that she possessed enchanted dolls. She denied all charges, but the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, windswept stretch just outside Salem. No prayers, no mercy, just the rope. The crowd watched as her execution set the machinery of death in motion. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some of the victims were respected members of the church. Rebecca Nurse, in particular, shocked the community. An elderly, devout woman beloved by many, she was initially found not guilty by the jury. Yet under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Her final words whispered a solemn warning: "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it made no difference. Executions continued through August, culminating in the deadliest day, September 22nd. 8 people were hanged that morning, including Martha Corey, who had openly questioned the trials, and her husband Giles Corey, who refused to enter a plea. Unable to proceed, the court resorted to a brutal English punishment. He was pressed to death, stones piled on his chest gradually over 3 days. Legend has it his final words were muffled by the weight. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in jail awaiting trial. Dozens falsely confessed to save their lives. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill, but across every heart. Fear had become law, and blind justice marched to the scaffold, while executions took center stage. Hundreds more were crammed into foul, freezing jails, waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small prison couldn't contain them all. Many were held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, and forgotten. Most were not witches, nor were they social outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, children, people whose only crime was a dispute with the wrong person or owning property someone else coveted. Personal grudges, cloaked as divine justice, drove much of the terror. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died, clearly witchcraft. Someone refused to help with firewood, surely a cursed axe. Mary Esty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such victim. A respected mother of 7 and known for her piety, she was initially released by the court, only to be rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final plea, Mary did not beg for her own life. She pleaded for the judges to halt the proceedings and prevent further innocent bloodshed. She was hanged shortly after. Another tragic case was Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. Under intense interrogation, Dorothy confessed to being a witch. Her fearful, gibberish answers were taken as truth. She spent 8 months chained in prison, and when finally released, she was irreparably traumatized. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later be executed, was sentenced to die. Her execution was delayed due to pregnancy, likely saving her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials concluded. Accusations continued to spiral. Some accused confessed under duress to save their own lives, naming others to shift suspicion. Entire families, fathers, mothers, daughters, were drawn into the hysteria. No one was immune. Meanwhile, the jails overflowed. Food was scarce, disease spread, and some perished while awaiting trial. New names were added weekly, as fear and paranoia gripped Salem. By the fall of 1692, the hysteria began to falter, not because the court regained reason, but because reality pushed back. The turning point arrived when accusations reached influential figures who had once supported the trials. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged as the ringleader of witches. Educated, articulate, and previously in conflict with powerful families, he became a target. On the day of his execution, Burroughs defied expectations. Standing on the gallows, he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. His courage and composure shook the court, signaling the beginning of the end for Salem's reign of terror. The crowd fell silent. Tears were shed, even by the most hardened onlookers. Yet the executions continued, though a seed of doubt had been planted. The hysteria reached a new peak when Mary Phipps, the governor's wife, was accused. Suddenly, fear had climbed to the highest ranks of Salem society. Governor William Phipps, already pressured by mounting chaos and criticism, finally acted in October 1692. He dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all ongoing trials and executions. Public opinion had shifted. Ministers who had once remained silent began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced spectral evidence. Better 10 suspected witches escape than one innocent condemned, he argued, a radical statement in a society that had long believed the opposite. Those who had once cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still overcrowded, but the appetite for more blood had waned. Too many respected citizens had been accused. Too many innocent lives had been lost. People finally recognized the truth. This was not divine justice. It was madness. Confessions dwindled. Some accusers recanted, while others vanished from public view. The once loud proponents of the trials now kept their heads down. Fear remained, but it had exhausted itself. The public craved stability. Officials wanted to preserve their authority. Salem, bruised and shaken, began to awaken from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, though the scars remained. By late 1692, the judicial machinery that had fueled the hysteria began to crumble under its own weight. With the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded, a new, more cautious system, the Superior Court of Judicature, was established in early 1693. This time, spectral evidence was banned, and judges approached accusations with far more skepticism. The result was immediate. Convictions slowed dramatically, and many accused witches were acquitted. Of the 56 cases heard by the new court, the majority were released. Even those who had previously confessed began recanting, admitting that fear, pressure, and coercion had forced their false testimonies. The dramatic displays of the afflicted girls lost their power. A pivotal moment in the unraveling of the trials involved Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion but was never formally charged. The fact that such a high-ranking, devout minister could be suspected underscored just how arbitrary and corrupt the trials had become. Once relentless, the courts now moved cautiously, quietly releasing those still imprisoned. First came those with minimal evidence against them, then even those who had confessed under extreme pressure. Meanwhile, the families of the executed began demanding justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his confiscated property, and Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. Fear gave way to shame. Church congregations were fractured, friendships severed, and the social fabric of Salem irreparably damaged. Recognizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, Governor Phipps pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. Yet freedom came at a cost. Many families were forced to pay for their own jail fees before regaining their liberty. Consider it: losing your home, your health, nearly your life, and then being billed for surviving. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 had died in prison, and over 200 had faced accusations. The court did not merely collapse, it imploded, leaving a chasm of grief, guilt, and disbelief in its wake. Though the trials were over, Salem's healing had only just begun. The village was forever changed by the lives lost, the justice abandoned, and the collective mirror of shame it now faced. The gallows were silent, the jails empty, yet peace remained elusive. Salem was haunted, not by specters, but by the weight of guilt. What began with a handful of ailing girls had escalated into a communal catastrophe. Families were torn apart, reputations ruined, and innocent lives extinguished. Survivors were left to navigate the wreckage. Neighbors could no longer meet each other's gaze. Those who once prayed side by side had turned against one another. Some of the afflicted girls quietly left town, while others receded from public view. A few, like in Putnam Jr., later admitted remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role, attributing her actions to delusion by Satan. But for many, the damage was irreparable. Even the officials carried a heavy burden of conscience. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures of the trials, was among the few who openly acknowledged his wrongdoing. In a striking act of public atonement, Judge Samuel Sewall stood during a church service in 1697 while a minister read his confession aloud, accompanied by a prayer for forgiveness. It was an unusual display of accountability in an era when most preferred to bury their complicity in silence. Yet forgetting the past proved impossible. Families of the condemned pressed for recognition and restitution, submitting petitions to the Massachusetts government for official pardons, restoration of property, and public acknowledgement of their loved ones' innocence. Gradually, the authorities responded. In 1711, the colony passed legislation restoring the rights and reputations of some victims and offering limited financial compensation to their heirs. However, the measures were incomplete. Families such as the Coreys and the Proctors were left uncompensated. Rumors of witchcraft lingered across New England, but in Salem, shame became a permanent part of the town's identity. In time, the village renamed itself Danvers, an attempt to distance from its dark legacy. Gallows Hill remained unmarked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead but the memory of what had occurred. Still, the stories persisted, whispered in sermons and in quiet conversations between former neighbors. Salem had not been under the sway of witches. It had been gripped by fear, pride, and unchecked authority. That shadow lingered long after the last rope was cut. Though the Salem witch trials concluded over 3 centuries ago, their impact endures, not only in textbooks and historical tours, but also in the way society contemplates justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 was not merely a bizarre episode of mass hysteria. It was a collapse of reason, compassion, and legal integrity. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, became executioners simply by believing too readily and questioning too little. Courts meant to safeguard the innocent instead became instruments of oppression. Religion was wielded as a weapon, testimony transformed into spectacle, and silence equated with guilt. Perhaps most chilling is how swiftly it all occurred. In mere months, fear overtook fact. Long-standing grudges masquerading as spiritual warfare became death sentences. No actual demons or devils were required, only belief in them. Yet the trials left enduring lessons. The Salem tragedy would serve as a cautionary tale for generations, repeatedly cited in debates over due process, civil liberties, and the dangers of allowing fear to dictate justice. The U.S. Constitution, drafted almost a century later, would explicitly outlaw measures that had condemned the accused in Salem, such as ex post facto laws and bills of attainder. It enshrined rights that the victims of Gallows Hill lacked: access to legal counsel, the ability to confront one's accusers, and the necessity of tangible evidence. These hard-won protections were forged, in part, from the grim lessons of those trials. Today, the term witch hunt is often thrown around casually to describe political persecution or moral panic, yet it rarely conveys the real terror endured in Salem. There, people were executed for crimes that existed only in imagination, betrayed by the very systems designed to protect them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that unchecked fear can become a tyranny in its own right. When fear is validated by authority, courts, churches, governments, it becomes nearly unstoppable. The Salem witch trials serve as a cautionary tale, not just of one village's descent into madness, but of how quickly reason can collapse under the weight of fear. The gallows may have disappeared and the courtrooms fallen silent, but the warning remains: truth is delicate, justice is never guaranteed, and history has a way of repeating itself. Fulvio, on the other hand, was born in 83 BCE into the elite yet somewhat eccentric Falvi family, an old plebeian house that had clawed its way into Rome's upper political ranks. While not among the oldest patrician lineages, the Falvis had produced consuls, generals, and orators. Their blood carried both ambition and a taste for disruption. Her father, Marcus Falvi, was better known for his awkward speech than his political influence. Nicknamed Bambi Leo for his stammer, he was far from the commanding presence his family's name suggested. Fulvio, however, showed no such hesitation. From a young age, she exuded authority. She grew up immersed in the sharp-edged world of Roman politics, surrounded by senators and generals debating strategy and policy under her roof. In that environment, Fulvio observed that politics extended beyond the forum, played out in marriages, funerals, rumors, and clandestine alliances. Women of elite Roman households were expected to remain quiet, refined, educated, and obedient. Fulvio would defy all of these expectations. Wealthy, well-educated, and highly connected, she was aware of her power and unafraid to wield it. Though the early years of her life remain shadowy, her later actions reveal a young woman who was politically astute, fiercely independent, and determined never to fade into the background. Fulvio possessed a formidable personality, a keen political intellect, and the determination to act decisively in the male-dominated sphere of Roman governance. She came of age during a period of extreme upheaval. The Republic was fracturing under civil wars, populist uprisings, and intense power struggles between figures like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. The traditional rules of Rome were crumbling, and chaos was the new order. Rather than shy away from instability, Fulvio learned to navigate it. Her upbringing did not cultivate the demure, obedient matron Rome idealized. Instead, it forged a woman who saw politics not as a man's exclusive domain, but as a battlefield to be understood, mastered, and manipulated. She would go on to marry 3 highly influential men, each a significant figure in Roman history. Yet Fulvio's ambition extended far beyond marital alliances. She commanded armies, led revolts, and became the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a deity, but as herself. Rome had not yet embraced the idea of female political authority, but Fulvia was ready to challenge that entirely. Her first marriage, to Publius Claudius Pulcher, was anything but conventional. Claudius was no ordinary noble. He was a populist firebrand, a master of street-level politics, chaos, and scandal. To Rome's elite, he was dangerous. To the people, he was a hero. For Fulvio, he represented both a bold partner and a strategic opportunity. Their union in the early 50s BCE connected her to a man who had transformed the Republic into his personal stage. Claudius was notorious for his theatrical defiance of tradition. On one occasion, he disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred female-only ceremony in Caesar's home, a scandal that only increased his popularity. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate, giving him veto power over the Senate and cementing his influence among the plebeians. Far from remaining a passive consort, Fulvio immersed herself in Claudius's political world. Ancient sources suggest she actively engaged with his supporters, maintained visibility during his campaigns, and managed their household as both a domestic and political hub. Together, they embodied a new type of Roman power duo, bold, populist, and unapologetically assertive. But this alliance came with a steep price. In 52 BCE, Claudius Pulcher was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His murder sent shockwaves through Rome, yet Fulvio refused to retreat into quiet mourning. She orchestrated a dramatic political funeral that historians still recall today, parading Claudius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum. The exposed wounds were on full display, shocking and enraging the public. Riots broke out, and the Senate House was set ablaze. Fulvio had transformed personal grief into public outrage. This was her first major political intervention, demonstrating her mastery of spectacle, emotional manipulation, and the strategic use of her late husband's legacy as a tool of power. With Claudius gone, Fulvio stepped firmly out of his shadow. She understood that in Rome, political capital was fleeting. Mourning could wait, opportunity could not. Shortly after Claudius's violent death, she remarried, this time to gain influence through Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and a devoted supporter of Julius Caesar. Curio might have seemed an unlikely match on the surface, known for flamboyance and dramatic flair. But behind the showmanship lay a keen strategist. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he wielded substantial authority during one of the Republic's most unstable periods, when Caesar's ambitions clashed with the Senate and Rome teetered on the brink of civil war. Fulvio recognized in him more than a husband. He was a conduit to the next center of political power. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated maneuver. With Claudius gone, Fulvio needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist momentum her first husband had built and secure the support of Caesar. Curio fulfilled both needs. Fulvio didn't simply marry into power, she helped steer it. She ensured Claudius's supporters remained engaged, reshaping their cause under Curio's leadership, keeping the urban populace mobilized, and solidifying her position as a central force in Rome's volatile political landscape. But Rome itself was unraveling rapidly. The conflict between Caesar and Pompey erupted into full-scale civil war. Curio threw himself into the fray on Caesar's side, and Fulvia, true to form, remained politically active. She reportedly coordinated support, managed resources, and helped maintain the loyalty of urban factions for her husband's campaign. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to strengthen Caesar's position, but the venture ended in catastrophe. Ambushed by the forces of King Juba, his army was destroyed, and Curio was killed. Once again, Fulvia was widowed, but Rome did not see her fading into obscurity. On the contrary, her resilience only enhanced her reputation. Having lost two husbands to civil unrest, both champions of populist causes, Fulvia had now proven herself a political force in her own right. Her boldest and most consequential alliance was still ahead. Her third and most renowned marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and steadfast supporter of Julius Caesar. Their union, around 47 BCE, was far more than a romantic connection. It was a strategic merger of influence. Fulvia had already mastered the art of Roman street politics, and Antony required that level of savvy to consolidate his power in Rome. Together, they became one of the most formidable political partnerships of the late Republic. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia had endured loss, navigated betrayal, and outmaneuvered countless rivals. Antony, notorious for his indulgence in drink, gambling, and scandal, now had at his side a partner who could actively defend his interests, maintain alliances, and rally his supporters while he campaigned abroad. Unlike any Roman woman before her, Fulvia exercised authority openly. She read Antony's correspondence, issued orders during his absence, attended political meetings, and influenced appointments. Contemporary sources, often hostile, painted her as domineering and power-hungry, but the true shock lay in her unprecedented assertiveness. She acted with the authority of a Roman man in a society that had no framework for such female power. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic plunged into chaos, setting the stage for Fulvia to play one of the most extraordinary roles in Roman political history. As Mark Antony rushed to solidify his position as Caesar's political heir, it was Fulvia who effectively held the reins of Rome. While Antony traveled to form the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia acted as his de facto representative in the capital. She managed patronage networks, coordinated with urban factions, and ensured Antony's supporters remained organized and loyal. She even orchestrated Antony's politically strategic reconciliation with Octavian by arranging the marriage of her daughter, Claudia, a union that would later unravel publicly. Fulvia was far more than a supportive spouse. She was Antony's proxy. Roman coins were minted bearing Antony's image alongside her name, an unprecedented public acknowledgement of her political authority. She operated openly in the center of power, challenging the traditional boundaries for women in Rome. Yet power in the city was never guaranteed, and Fulvia's influence would test just how far a woman could assert authority before Rome reacted. While Antony conducted military campaigns and negotiated political alliances across the Roman world, Fulvia controlled the streets of Rome. She acted as his regent, navigating a city governed by violence, bribery, and influence. Fulvia demonstrated that she could maneuver through Roman politics as effectively, if not more so, than the male senators and magistrates. In the turbulent aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Rome was a battleground without swords. Power shifted rapidly, and Fulvia anchored Antony's authority in the capital by serving as his political stand-in. She directed allies, negotiated with urban factions, managed the plebeian population, and even waged rhetorical battles with political opponents. She financed loyal troops, distributed bribes to maintain public order, and influenced legislation to protect Antony's interests. Hostile ancient sources, such as Appian and Cassius Dio, often depicted Fulvia as manipulative, quarrelsome, and warmongering. Yet beneath the misogynistic exaggeration was a woman exercising real political authority in a society that had no model for female power beyond domestic roles. Fulvia built coalitions, supported military commanders, and issued directives, tasks usually reserved for senators or consuls. She also cultivated public visibility and relationships with veteran soldiers, a critical political force in late Republican Rome. While Antony campaigned in the east, Fulvia became the face of his authority in Italy, meeting with centurions, shaping decisions on land distribution, and reinforcing that loyalty to Antony carried tangible rewards. But Fulvia's rise to power came with serious risks. Rome's aristocracy, especially those aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir, and Antony's growing rival, resented her influence. They saw her as a dangerously ambitious woman, wielding control over armies, legislation, and loyalty with unprecedented autonomy. Fulvia, however, was fully aware of the stakes. She recognized the growing rift between Antony and Octavian. Their uneasy alliance was fraying, and she grasped something both men underestimated. Rome could not accommodate them both. While diplomacy might delay the inevitable, Fulvia prepared for confrontation. Having long operated in the shadows of male power, she was now ready to act openly. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did what no Roman woman had ever done before. She went to war. With Antony still in the east, she allied with his younger brother, Lucius Antonius, a consul, to directly challenge Octavia, Octavian's sister, and by extension, Octavian's authority in Italy. Their ostensible aim was to defend Antony's interests and secure land for his veteran supporters. Yet Fulvia's hand was unmistakable throughout. This was a calculated, personal assertion of power. This bold rebellion, later called the Perusine War, was sparked in part by Octavia's land redistribution program, which displaced Italians to reward Octavian's veterans. Fulvia seized the growing public unrest and framed Octavian as a traitor to Caesar's legacy. With Lucius serving as her political figurehead in the Senate, Fulvia orchestrated the war behind the scenes, rallying 8 legions and taking control of the city of Perugia. Ancient accounts suggest that Fulvia was more deeply invested in the campaign than Lucius, personally directing troops, stirring public sentiment, and corresponding with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors of her issuing commands and guiding her brother-in-law into actions he had not planned. Octavian, startled by her audacity, responded decisively. He besieged Perugia over the winter of 41 to 40 BCE, cutting off supplies and pounding the city into submission. Trapped by dwindling resources and political isolation, Fulvia's daring gamble ultimately unraveled, demonstrating both the reach and the limits of her extraordinary authority. By early 40 BCE, Perugia had surrendered. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a diplomatic gesture to avoid enraging Antony, but Fulvia was exiled. The woman who had once orchestrated riots, commanded armies, and shaped public opinion was now considered too dangerous to remain in Rome. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, hoping to reunite with Antony, but he did not come to her side. The powerful partnership between Fulvia and Antony had fractured. Though she had acted in his name, perhaps without his explicit approval, she had dared what no Roman woman had attempted before, to wage a civil war. Now the Republic exacted its punishment. Exiled to Greece, Fulvia found herself in a kind of diplomatic limbo, a holding place for those whose ambitions had overstepped the bounds of acceptable power. Fulvia had risked everything, not for personal gain, but to defend Antony's honor, his authority, and their shared vision for Rome. Yet in exile, she received no hero's welcome. Antony, meanwhile, had already become entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their affair had begun or was merely imminent, the timing was a bitter blow. While Fulvia raised legions and led armies, Antony was entertaining a queen, leaving her efforts politically and personally unacknowledged. Ancient sources, such as Plutarch, suggest Antony was angry with her for initiating the Perusine War without consulting him. Others argue he may have welcomed her downfall, as it cleared the path for a strategic alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never have tolerated. Some of Antony's loyal soldiers urged reconciliation, but her health was failing after the strain of siege, war, and betrayal. In 40 BCE, Fulvia died, likely from a combination of illness, stress, and heartbreak, at around 43 years old. Her death conveniently cleared the way for Antony to negotiate peace with Octavian and marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, solidifying a temporary political truce. The triumvirate was momentarily reunited, but only because the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs was no longer alive. Fulvia's legacy would eventually be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose fame would eclipse nearly every Roman woman of the era. Yet Fulvia was the original prototype of female political audacity. She did not wield influence from the shadows. She stepped into the center of power, commanded armies, and defied a society that treated women as mere accessories. Rome was unprepared for her, and so it tried to erase her. Even after her death in 40 BCE, the men she had once manipulated, Antony, Octavian, and former allies, quietly worked to reshape her story. Deprived of the ability to defend herself, Fulvia became a convenient scapegoat. Ancient historians, almost all men with vested interests, cast her as the cause of the Perusine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, and the broader turmoil of the Republic. Appian, Dio, Cassius, and Plutarch portrayed her as jealous, overbearing, and power-hungry, blaming her for dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict and for Antony's estrangement from Rome. Yet such claims were hardly fair. Fulvia had operated in a political arena where cunning, violence, and strategic maneuvering were expected, at least from men. She was no more ambitious than Caesar, no more aggressive than Pompey, and far less ruthless than Octavian ultimately proved to be. Her real crime was simply acting like a Roman man in a society that had no precedent for women exercising public authority. She did not remain cloistered, weaving or quietly supporting her husband. She wrote to generals, organized street demonstrations, and commanded loyalty from soldiers. That made her a threat, not only to Octavian but to the historical narrative itself. Even Antony, the man whose career she had bolstered and whose legacy she fought to defend, ultimately used her death as a political tool, smoothing the way for his reconciliation with Octavian. There were no public honors, no monuments, no grand funerals or Senate tributes for Fulvia. Rome attempted to silence her memory, yet it could not erase the reality of her achievements. She had commanded armies, influenced elections, negotiated alliances, and dared to wage civil war. Her bold actions ensured that, despite the silence imposed on her, Fulvia's impact on Roman history could never be entirely forgotten. Fulvia was the first Roman woman whose name appeared on coinage, not as a goddess or allegory, but as a genuine political actor. Attempts to tarnish her reputation were deliberate, yet her presence in history was equally intentional. Despite centuries of caricature, slander, and erasure, Fulvia refused to disappear. Her defiance still resonates, if one listens beyond the biased voices of male historians. Though her story concludes in silence, her legacy speaks loudly. For generations after her death, historians struggled to situate her in Rome's narrative because Fulvia shattered every expectation of what a Roman woman could be. She did not advise from the shadows, she embodied power itself. Her audacity unsettled a patriarchal society, for she wielded influence through action, not mere suggestion. In a culture where women were meant to sway through whispering, social charm, or marriage, Fulvia spoke through policy, political theater, and warfare. She was not a passive consort. She was a strategist and a commander. Yet much of the historical record remembers her for defiance rather than achievement. Roman chroniclers, uncomfortable with a woman who refused to stay in her place, painted her as ambitious, disruptive, and quarrelsome. Look closer, however, and a different Fulvia emerges. She was the first woman to mint coins bearing her name. She orchestrated political factions, turned marriage into a tactical instrument, and skillfully navigated the turbulent street politics of civil war. She did not drift through history as a bystander. She shaped outcomes, influenced generals, and steered the course of Rome's civil conflicts. Her failures were not due to incompetence, but to timing and gender. Had she been born male, she might have been remembered alongside Caesar or Cato as a brilliant political operator. Instead, she was labeled the dangerous woman who dared too much. Her shadow lingered. Later women, such as Livia, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though in a different context, operated in the space Fulvia carved out. They manipulated emperors, commanded loyalty, and influenced succession. Fulvia did it first, without an imperial title or formal protection. Today, modern scholarship is reclaiming her story, recognizing her not as a cautionary tale, but as one of Rome's most politically active and audacious women. Fulvia tested the boundaries of female power and paid the ultimate price, but her impact endures. Fulvia didn't merely exist during Rome's era of triumph. She challenged it head-on. While the city may have tried to erase her, she left traces of her influence in every corner of its decline. She wasn't a footnote. She was a force, a woman far ahead of her time. Fast forward to the summer of 1963. The United States stood at a crossroads, torn between entrenched systems of oppression and a restless drive for freedom in the Deep South. Segregation was more than custom, it was codified law. Black Americans were denied access to schools, restaurants, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police violence was routine, and in cities like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters faced snarling dogs and high-pressure fire hoses. Yet, change was on the horizon, insisting on itself. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had claimed national attention. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts filled headlines. Figures like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis were no longer just individuals. They were icons of defiance. The March on Washington did not emerge overnight. It was the culmination of decades of growing frustration, hope, and organized activism. Black Americans were no longer willing to wait. They demanded civil rights, recognition, and respect, and they intended to make their voices heard at the nation's capital. The idea of a mass demonstration in Washington, D.C. had existed for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and veteran civil rights advocate, first proposed it in the 1940s to pressure the Roosevelt administration into desegregating the defense industry. That march was called off after Roosevelt issued an executive order, but in 1963, the stakes were higher than ever. Randolph, together with other leaders including Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., revived the plan. This time, the march was about more than employment. It was about dignity, voting rights, desegregation in schools, equal pay, and the fundamental right to live without fear. Despite differences, over a dozen major civil rights organizations united to organize the event, understanding that solidarity would amplify their message and their impact. The countdown was on. Buses were being coordinated, flyers circulated, and word of mouth spread faster than any newspaper. Across the nation, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most iconic moments in U.S. history. The dream was taking shape, step by step, foot by foot. Organizing a demonstration in Washington, D.C. was already a challenge. Planning one for over 100,000 participants bordered on madness. The logistics alone were staggering. Transportation, food, water, restrooms, medical teams, sound systems, permits, crowd management, and safety measures. Yet against all odds, it came together. At the heart of this massive undertaking stood Bayard Rustin. Openly gay and often kept in the background for political reasons, he was a master tactician. Having studied nonviolence under Gandhi's disciples in India and endured jail, beatings, and FBI surveillance, Rustin remained unshakable. He envisioned the March on Washington as a demonstration of disciplined, peaceful protest executed with military precision. In just 8 weeks, he and his team turned the idea into reality. Officially named the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the event deliberately combined calls for racial equality with demands for economic justice. While Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. would emerge as the spiritual and moral emblem of the day, it was Randolph and Rustin who ensured the agenda highlighted unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights alongside civil rights. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were on edge, worried about potential riots, backlash, or even violence. Civil rights leaders reassured them that the march would remain peaceful, yet precautions were strict. The National Guard stood ready, hospitals prepared for emergencies, liquor sales were suspended, and federal workers were allowed to stay home. Unity was another hurdle. The major civil rights organizations, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over strategy. Some advocated more radical tactics, others preferred careful diplomacy. The young activists of SNCC were growing impatient with King's nonviolent approach. Yet all agreed on one thing. The time for silence had ended. Rustin's planning read like a military campaign. Every bus and train was accounted for. Every speaker had an exact schedule. Every route was supervised by marshals trained in crowd control. This was more than a march. It was a carefully orchestrated moment meant to move the nation's conscience. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. By 9 a.m., the sun blazed overhead, and humidity clung to skin like a second layer. But nothing could stop the marchers. From every corner of the country they came, black and white, young and old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, others carried protest signs. By the afternoon, over 250,000 people had gathered on the National Mall, a tidal wave of hope and determination. Remarkably, there was no chaos. Despite government fears of riots or violence, the scene was orderly and disciplined. Volunteers guided the crowds, the Red Cross handed out water, and groups sang freedom songs, clasped hands, and cheered as more marchers arrived. Gospel choirs filled the air near the reflecting pool, and chants demanding jobs and freedom reverberated against the marble of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities were present: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, but not for fanfare. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause far larger than any individual. The crowd moved with purpose and unity. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. For many Black Americans, merely standing there was itself an act of quiet rebellion, a statement of visibility, recognition, and dignity. It was a full-circle moment, generations in the making. At precisely noon, the official program began. Speakers representing diverse organizations, regions, and ideologies took the stage, yet all echoed the same demands: desegregated schools, fair wages, equal pay, and an end to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang, joined by the memory of Marian Anderson, who had once been barred from performing at Constitution Hall because of her race. Now she performed beneath the open sky for thousands. As the hours passed, the air was charged, not with fear, but with anticipation and a shared sense of historic significance. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived, and when it did, it would stop the world. This march was more than history in the making. It was becoming legend. By mid-afternoon, a hush fell over the crowd, not from fatigue, but from anticipation. At the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped forward. He wore a dark suit, a neatly knotted tie, and a calm expression that barely contained the fire within. In his hands were prepared remarks, carefully drafted with his advisors the night before. Yet what the world would remember was not the words on paper, but the passion flowing from his heart. He began with deliberate intensity, recounting the harsh realities of segregation, police brutality, and the broken promises of freedom. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell with the cadence of a sermon. He wielded repetition, rhythm, and silence as tools, capturing the crowd's full attention. Some listeners nodded, others wiped away tears, while many held signs simply stating, "Now." Then came the pivotal moment. Behind him, gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had performed earlier, cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." King set aside his notes, gripped the podium, and spoke from the soul. "I have a dream," he began. Each phrase carried weight, clarity, and conviction. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. I have a dream that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The speech transcended words. It became a vision, a prayer, a spark striking through history. When King concluded with, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted, applause, tears, shouts of joy. They understood they had witnessed more than an address. they had heard prophecy. The March on Washington's power lay not just in the speeches or music, but in the courage, hope, and vision it embodied. The power of the day came from the people themselves. The sheer number of individuals gathered was staggering. They arrived from every corner of the country: Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and beyond. Some were veteran activists, having marched countless times before. Others were attending their first protest, leaving their hometowns for the first time. They packed lunches, endured bus rides of over 20 hours, and slept in their Sunday clothes just to witness history. Among them were ordinary citizens, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who did not see themselves as leaders but as witnesses to change. They weren't merely asking for progress, they were embodying it. Children were there too, young girls with ribbons in their hair, boys holding hand-drawn signs, toddlers perched on their parents' shoulders to glimpse the Lincoln Memorial and hear the speeches echoing over the loudspeakers. It was more than an event. It was the dawn of a new era. Some faces stood out. John Lewis, just 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had originally written a fiery, uncompromising speech that senior leaders persuaded him to soften at the last minute. Even-tempered, his words carried an electric charge, shaking the crowd with their urgency. Daisy Bates also spoke, the only woman on the program, delivering a statement on behalf of other civil rights women. Though brief, her words highlighted a painful truth. Even within a movement for equality, some voices had to fight to be heard. The crowd also included union organizers, rabbis, nuns, priests, and students from every walk of life. They did not all agree on tactics. Some favored King's disciplined nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant approach. But for that single day, unity prevailed. It was a living tapestry of solidarity. Black and white hands joined, buttons declaring freedom now pinned proudly, the collective breath of 250,000 people rising together. Each person in that sea of faces was more than an observer. They were participants in shaping history. While the world saw a powerful, unified march on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the reality behind the scenes was far messier, held together by determination, sweat, last-minute compromises, and tireless organization. Bayard Rustin, the mastermind behind the march, faced obstacles beyond mere logistics. His identity, as an openly gay man and former communist, was constantly under scrutiny, and some civil rights leaders worried opponents might use it to undermine the movement. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of having a romantic relationship, a threat that had previously forced King to remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That shadow lingered throughout the march's planning. The role of women in the movement was also complicated. Leaders like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height had been instrumental, yet none were given prominent speaking roles. Rosa Parks attended as an honored guest, admired by all, but she was not afforded a platform during the high-profile event. The march, like the movement itself, was still grappling with hierarchies and blind spots. Even within the Big Six organizations, tension simmered. Young SNCC leaders were growing frustrated with the cautious approach of the older generation and wanted to challenge systemic racism more directly. CORE shared similar concerns, yet for the sake of unity on that day, moderation prevailed. Meanwhile, the federal government monitored every move. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI deployed over 100 agents to track organizers, bug hotel rooms, follow key figures, and compile detailed dossiers. They feared the march might erupt into violence or be co-opted by communists, though nothing of the sort occurred. Despite their extensive surveillance, the event remained peaceful. Financial pressures added another layer of complexity. The march cost more than $250,000, millions in today's terms, mostly raised through unions and sympathetic donors. Organizers scrambled until the last moment, improvising solutions, even borrowing walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also profoundly human. Imperfect, messy, political, and unfinished, much like the country it sought to transform. As the sun dipped behind the Washington Monument, the crowd slowly began to disperse. People embraced, cried, sang, and lingered, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. The speeches had been delivered, the banners held high, and the world had witnessed it all. But in the humid August air, one question remained. What comes next? In the days that followed, media coverage was cautiously optimistic, hinting at the potential impact of this unprecedented demonstration. Major newspapers recognized the historic significance of the March on Washington, though often with a detached tone. Many described it as orderly and dignified, a polite way of noting that no riots had occurred. Few reports delved into the specifics of the protesters' demands, such as a federal jobs program or a minimum wage equivalent to roughly $20 today. Yet Dr. King's speech could not be ignored, dominating coverage and capturing national attention. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially been skeptical about the march, watched it unfold on television with a mix of admiration and surprise. He later described the event as impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House. Still, legislative progress remained slow. The Civil Rights Act he had proposed lingered in Congress, stymied by entrenched Southern opposition. Some activists felt frustration. They had hoped the march would trigger immediate change, only to return to the persistent grind of organizing, protesting, and mourning those lost in the fight for justice. That reality struck tragically just weeks later, on September 15, 1963, when 34 black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been proclaimed, but the nightmare continued. Yet the march marked a turning point. It demonstrated that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It united an unprecedented coalition of labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all converging for justice. The event gave the civil rights movement a voice, a dream, and a speech that would reverberate across generations. While the March on Washington did not produce immediate legislative victories, it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, outlawing segregation in public spaces and banning employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the heart of Jim Crow laws. The march had ended, but its impact was enduring. It reshaped America's moral conscience, laying the foundation for justice, equality, and the power of collective action. What began as a bold act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement, permanently altering the way Americans understood democracy and the fight for human rights. Could these landmark bills have passed without the March on Washington? Perhaps, but would they have carried the same moral weight and exerted the same undeniable pressure on the nation? Almost certainly not. For Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., the speech he delivered that day elevated him from a respected civil rights leader to a global icon. Yet such prominence came with profound costs, constant surveillance, repeated threats, and ultimately, his assassination in 1968. The words he spoke that August day, the dream he envisioned, have only grown more poignant, tragic, and revered over time. For the wider civil rights movement, the march was proof of the power of unity. It offered organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization and inspired a generation of activists both domestically and internationally. Anti-apartheid leaders in South Africa, student movements across Europe, and human rights advocates around the globe have all cited the March on Washington as a model for peaceful, coordinated protest. But the legacy of the march extends beyond history books. The language and ideals of that day, the call for jobs and freedom, the commitment to nonviolent resistance, and the resonance of I Have a Dream, continue to influence modern activism. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant, every protest sign, and every act of civic courage. Today, Dr. King's Memorial, standing just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial, offers a powerful symbol of that enduring legacy. Yet the true memorial is not carved in stone. It lives in classrooms, in voting booths, in marches, and in the voices of those who refuse to stay silent. The dream of equality was never meant to rest in history. It was meant to be enacted, lived, and fought for. More than 6 decades have passed since that sweltering August day when over 250,000 people gathered beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museums. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools, and his voice continues to echo through the nation's collective memory. But the question endures: has the dream been fully realized, or is it still a work in progress? Progress is evident in many ways. Legal segregation has been dismantled, voting rights were secured through sacrifice and activism, and the presence of Black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a 2-term U.S. president would have been unimaginable in 1963. Interracial marriage, once banned in much of the country, is now protected under federal law. Yet the struggle continues, reminding each generation that the dream requires constant vigilance and action. These are not minor achievements. They are victories painstakingly earned through decades of relentless struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding persistence. Yet, for all the progress marked by legal victories and shifting social norms, many of the original goals of the 1963 March on Washington, the very demands that galvanized over 250,000 Americans to converge on the National Mall, remain partially unrealized. Dr. King's resonant words, immortalized in history as the "I Have a Dream" speech, often overshadow the practical and material demands of the march. The call for full employment, the establishment of a living wage, fair housing, access to quality education, and protection against systemic violence. These demands were not mere rhetorical flourishes. They were precise, urgent, and rooted in the lived realities of millions of Black Americans who faced barriers that were both legal and structural, barriers that continue to shape the contours of American life today. The March on Washington was meant to illuminate injustice in all its forms, and while King's oratory immortalized the vision of racial equality, it is vital to remember that the march also demanded economic equity. The call for a living wage, for instance, was not symbolic. It was a recognition that justice must be measured not only in moral and legal terms, but also in the tangible capacity for a family to live, eat, educate their children, and plan for the future. Yet, even decades later, disparities in wages persist along racial and geographic lines. In many cities, zip codes continue to determine educational opportunities, health outcomes, and access to stable employment. The intersection of race and class remains a stubbornly resistant challenge, reflecting a society where the promise of the march is only partially fulfilled. Police brutality, the very catalyst for much of early civil rights activism, remains an urgent concern. From Birmingham to Ferguson, from Trayvon Martin to George Floyd, the specter of unchecked state violence continues to provoke outrage and inspire mobilization. The same streets where King and his contemporaries once marched, insisting on dignity and justice, are still the stage for protests demanding accountability and systemic reform. And yet, despite the decades of activism, legal reforms, and social awareness, these issues remain unhealed wounds in the American body politic. The dream of economic and social justice. The dream of a society where opportunity is not predestined by skin color, birth circumstances, or geographic location, remains unfinished. Movements such as Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle of the 1963 March, echoing its imagery, language, and strategic approach while adapting it to the technological and social realities of the 21st century. Social media amplifies their message, enabling mobilization on an unprecedented scale, yet also exposing activists to new forms of surveillance and political pushback. Modern organizers march through the same streets, chant similar refrains of equality, and demand the fulfillment of rights that remain elusive. The continuity between the March on Washington and contemporary activism demonstrates that the struggle for justice is generational, ongoing, and unyielding. It is crucial to understand that the March on Washington was never intended to be the final chapter in the fight for civil rights. It was a flashpoint, a clarion call, a symbolic and practical assertion of human dignity. It established a public, unmistakable stake. This is who we are. This is what we demand. The event was not a resolution, but a declaration, a vivid articulation of both grievance and hope. Its impact was both immediate and long-lasting, yet its aims were never fully realized at the time, nor are they fully realized today. The momentum created by the march fueled legislative victories in the years that followed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public spaces and prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck at the heart of institutionalized disenfranchisement, empowering Black Americans to exercise their rights at the ballot box. These were monumental achievements, legal milestones that reshaped the structural framework of the United States. Yet, even these laws did not dismantle the deep-seated inequalities that underpinned systemic racism. They were, in a sense, the foundation stones of a longer, ongoing struggle, a struggle that continues in the courts, in legislatures, and on the streets. The symbolic power of the March on Washington cannot be overstated. It created a moral imperative that transcended legislative chambers. It captured the imagination of the world, demonstrating the potential of nonviolent mass mobilization to challenge entrenched injustice. But the march's enduring significance lies not merely in the speeches or the media coverage, but in the lived experience of those who participated. Ordinary Americans, maids, teachers, steelworkers, clerks, students, stood shoulder to shoulder with seasoned activists. They became both witnesses to history and participants in its making. They brought their families, their children, and their dignity. The presence of youth, elders, clergy, laborers, and everyday citizens highlighted the universality of the struggle and underscored that justice is both a personal and collective responsibility. Consider the participation of young activists like John Lewis, who at 23 represented the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Lewis, whose fiery rhetoric initially drew the concern of older civil rights leaders, demonstrated the energy and impatience of a younger generation demanding immediate change. His presence, along with that of figures like Daisy Bates, who spoke on behalf of Black women in the movement, underscored the diverse voices that contributed to the march. Yet, it also revealed the ongoing tension within the movement regarding representation, strategy, and priorities. Women, while central to organizing and logistics, were often sidelined in public speaking roles, a reflection of both societal norms and internal movement hierarchies that still demanded navigation and negotiation. Behind the scenes, the orchestration of the march resembled a military operation more than a traditional protest. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the event, coordinated logistics with meticulous precision. Every bus and train route, every speaker's schedule, every volunteer's responsibilities, and every route for crowd movement was carefully mapped. Rustin's experience with nonviolent activism and his study of Gandhi's philosophy of civil resistance proved invaluable. Despite facing discrimination for his identity as a gay man and scrutiny for past political associations, he orchestrated a movement that was disciplined, visible, and effective. Rustin's mastery ensured that over 250,000 individuals could converge in one place without descending into chaos, a feat that remains unparalleled in American protest history. The scale of the crowd itself transformed the meaning of the event. People traveled across the nation from every state, some for over 20 hours, to be present. They came by bus, train, car, and on foot, carrying signs and wearing the clothing they had for church or work. Their collective presence was both symbolic and literal evidence of a nationwide demand for change. For many, simply standing on the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial was a revolutionary act. It marked a convergence of generations, a reckoning with a nation that had promised equality and systematically denied it. Dr. King's speech, while the most remembered moment of the day, was part of a broader program of voices, demands, and cultural expression. Gospel music, including performances by Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson, infused the event with spiritual resonance and cultural significance. Every chant, every hymn, and every speech contributed to the sense that the march was not just a protest, but a moral, ethical, and spiritual affirmation. When King set aside his prepared notes at Mahalia Jackson's urging and delivered the now famous "I Have a Dream" passage, the march transcended politics to become a living vision of possibility. His words articulated the deepest aspirations of a generation and provided a moral compass for future activism. The aftermath of the march revealed both its power and its limits. While national attention was focused on King's speech and the peaceful nature of the gathering, many newspapers minimized the practical demands of the march. Calls for federal jobs programs, minimum wage increases, and protections for the working class received scant attention, as the media often preferred to frame the event in terms of spectacle or personality. Political leaders, including President Kennedy, watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Legislative progress remained slow, and in some instances, the violent realities of ongoing oppression reasserted themselves, as tragically exemplified by the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham just weeks later. Yet, even amidst setbacks, the march shifted the moral landscape of the nation. It demonstrated that mass protest could be disciplined, dignified, and impossible to ignore. It forged coalitions across racial, religious, and socioeconomic lines, illustrating that collective action could amplify voices that had long been silenced. It set a template for future movements, inspiring activism not only within the United States, but across the globe. From anti-apartheid campaigns in South Africa to student protests in Europe, the strategic, nonviolent mass mobilization of the March on Washington became a model of effective social advocacy. Despite these achievements, the fundamental demands of the march remain an ongoing challenge. Economic inequality persists, as systemic barriers continue to shape opportunities and outcomes. Racial disparities in education, healthcare, and housing remain entrenched. Police violence continues to provoke national outrage. The dream articulated by King, a nation in which children are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, remains partially deferred. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter draw direct inspiration from the 1963 march, highlighting that the struggle for justice is not a single event, but a continuum of effort, sacrifice, and civic engagement. The legacy of the march, therefore, is both historical and living. It exists in law, in memory, and in ongoing activism. It informs how Americans understand civil rights, democracy, and the power of collective action. It demonstrates that meaningful change requires both moral vision and practical organization, that symbolism and policy must work hand in hand, and that the fight for justice is never truly finished. The dream of the march persists because it is not static. It is renewed with every generation that refuses to accept inequality and marches, speaks, votes, and acts for justice. The lessons of the March on Washington are clear. Progress is neither linear nor guaranteed. Legal victories, while crucial, are insufficient without sustained social engagement. The march illustrates that systemic injustice can only be addressed when ordinary people unite, strategize, and insist that their voices be heard. It reminds us that symbolic acts of protest, when coordinated effectively and grounded in moral authority, can alter the trajectory of history. Yet it also warns that victory is fragile, that laws and reforms require constant vigilance to ensure they are upheld and extended. Above all, the march affirms the enduring power of hope. It shows that collective action, grounded in principle and executed with discipline, can bend the arc of history toward justice. The voices that spoke, sang, and marched that day were not merely expressing discontent. They were claiming their rightful place in the nation's story. They demonstrated that rights are neither gifted nor guaranteed. They are demanded, fought for, and maintained through persistent engagement. The march also underscores the importance of memory. King's speech continues to resonate not because it was written or delivered with eloquence alone, but because it articulated a moral vision that has been repeatedly invoked, studied, and embodied in ongoing activism. The words, "I have a dream," serve as both inspiration and challenge, reminding successive generations that the work of justice is unfinished. They urge us to reflect, to act, and to hold ourselves accountable to the ideals for which countless individuals marched, suffered, and sacrificed. In the final analysis, the March on Washington of August 28, 1963, was neither the beginning nor the conclusion of the struggle for civil rights. It was a pivotal moment, a moral, political, and cultural watershed that crystallized the aspirations of a movement, amplified its demands, and set a precedent for disciplined, mass activism. Its immediate victories were legal and symbolic. Its enduring legacy is aspirational, challenging each generation to confront injustice, champion equality, and march again until the dream becomes a fully realized reality. The dream persists today because it was never meant to rest in history. It is alive in classrooms, in courtrooms, in the voting booth, and in every act of civic courage. It is renewed each time ordinary people rise, organize, and demand justice. The march may have ended on that sweltering August day, but its spirit remains, undaunted, unyielding, and ever urgent. The dream is deferred, challenged, and reinterpreted, but it is still alive. The work of making it reality continues, and it belongs to all who are willing to carry it forward. The summer of 1963 in the United States was a time of tension, hope, and transformation. Across the country, a long-standing struggle for equality and justice had reached a boiling point. Black Americans were living under a system of segregation that was codified into law in many states and enforced through custom and intimidation elsewhere. From the sidewalks of Montgomery to the schools of Little Rock, from bus stops in Birmingham to lunch counters in Greensboro, the barriers were pervasive. African Americans were denied access to the same resources and opportunities as their white counterparts. They were barred from restaurants, schools, buses, and even basic public facilities such as drinking fountains. Voting rights, a cornerstone of civic participation, were systematically obstructed through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. In the Deep South, the threat of violence, both state-sanctioned and vigilante, loomed large over daily life. Police brutality, beatings, arrests, and lynchings were grim realities, and fear was a constant companion. Yet in this oppressive climate, a powerful surge of resistance had begun to emerge, one rooted in courage, moral conviction, and an unyielding belief in the promise of freedom. The civil rights movement had been building for decades, a vast, complex, and interconnected struggle that encompassed the lives of millions. Every act of defiance, whether large or small, contributed to a growing sense of possibility. Sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, freedom rides across state lines, and bus boycotts in cities across the South demonstrated both the ingenuity and determination of activists. Each protest was not merely symbolic, but a strategic challenge to unjust systems. Leaders like Rosa Parks, whose quiet act of resistance sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, and Medgar Evers, who tirelessly organized voter registration drives in Mississippi, had become emblematic of this relentless push for change. John Lewis, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Diane Nash, and countless others were mobilizing communities, forming organizations, and challenging authorities in ways that demanded national attention. Their work demonstrated that the fight for civil rights was not spontaneous. It was organized, deliberate, and deeply strategic. By 1963, the momentum of the civil rights movement had begun to permeate public consciousness. Stories of courageous activism and the harsh backlash against it were appearing in newspapers and on television screens across the nation. Americans could no longer ignore the stark inequities faced by Black citizens. Images of peaceful protesters being met with snarling dogs, fire hoses, and batons in Birmingham were broadcast into living rooms across the country, sparking outrage and empathy alike. The moral contradictions of a nation that celebrated liberty and justice while condoning oppression were becoming impossible to ignore. Across the country, communities debated, protested, and reflected, grappling with the dissonance between national ideals and lived reality. In this climate, the stage was set for a historic demonstration, one that would bring together thousands of voices into a unified cry for freedom, dignity, and justice. The idea of a mass march on the nation's capital had been circulating for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and veteran civil rights advocate, had first proposed the concept in the 1940s. At the time, the march was intended to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. Although the protest was ultimately called off after an executive order partially addressed the issue, the notion of a coordinated, visible demonstration of Black Americans' collective power had taken root. By 1963, the conditions were markedly different. The struggle had broadened beyond labor and employment issues to encompass education, voting rights, housing, and the fight against systemic violence. The stakes were higher, and the need for a national, unified protest had never been more urgent. To turn this vision into reality, civil rights leaders formed a coalition of organizations, commonly referred to as the Big Six. These included the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Despite their shared objectives, the coalition faced significant challenges. Leaders had differing philosophies and approaches. Some advocated for immediate, radical change, while others favored gradualism and negotiation. Tensions between generations, genders, and strategies were omnipresent. Yet, the leaders understood that unity was crucial. Only a coordinated, massive demonstration could capture national attention and convey the seriousness of their demands. At the heart of planning the march was Bayard Rustin, a man whose intellect, strategic acumen, and organizational skills were unmatched. Rustin approached the march as one would a military campaign, meticulously designing every aspect. Every train and bus route was mapped, every volunteer assigned specific responsibilities, and every speaker's schedule carefully timed. Rustin understood that the scale of the event could easily descend into chaos without careful planning. Over 250,000 participants were expected, and the stakes were enormous. A failure in logistics could give opponents ammunition to dismiss the movement or, worse, result in violence. Rustin's experience with nonviolent protest, shaped in part by the philosophy of Gandhi and direct study under his followers, proved invaluable. Despite facing discrimination for being openly gay and under constant scrutiny from both government agencies and skeptics within the movement, Rustin maintained focus and determination, demonstrating that strategy, discipline, and foresight were as critical to social change as moral conviction. The logistical planning was only part of the challenge. Organizers also had to contend with political pressures. The Kennedy administration was wary of mass protests in the nation's capital, fearing unrest or negative public perception. Civil rights leaders had to reassure authorities that the march would remain peaceful while simultaneously galvanizing their constituents to attend in full force. Financial constraints presented another hurdle. Raising over $250,000, equivalent to several $1 million today, required relentless solicitation from unions, sympathetic donors, and grassroots fundraising. Every detail, from sanitation to crowd control, from food distribution to medical preparedness, had to be addressed with precision. The effort was immense, yet it also demonstrated the capacity of ordinary people, guided by extraordinary leaders, to mobilize for a shared purpose. As the summer progressed, word spread across the country. Churches, schools, labor unions, and civil rights organizations became conduits for information. Flyers were distributed, trains and buses booked, and word-of-mouth networks activated. From the Mississippi Delta to the industrial cities of the North, Black Americans began to prepare for a moment unlike any they had experienced. The march was not merely a demonstration, it was a statement of identity, of agency, of collective dignity. For many, simply participating was an assertion of humanity in a society that had systematically denied it. The sheer scale of anticipation, coordination, and resolve set the stage for what would become one of the most defining moments in American history. By late August, Washington, D.C. was transformed. The National Mall, stretching from the Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol, would become the stage upon which history unfolded. Volunteers, organizers, and marchers alike prepared for the culmination of months of effort. Expectations were high, nerves taut, but determination unshakable. The march promised to be more than a protest. It would be a moral statement, a visible manifestation of the demand for equality, and a challenge to a nation that had long ignored the voices of its Black citizens. And so, as the sweltering heat of late summer settled over the Capitol, the country stood at a precipice. The pieces were in place, leaders ready to speak, organizers ready to act, participants ready to march. The air was thick with anticipation, hope, and the collective weight of centuries of oppression and aspiration. In the distance, the Lincoln Memorial loomed, a symbolic reminder of both the promises made and the promises unfulfilled. That summer, America was about to witness a moment that would reverberate through history, a moment that would define the moral, political, and cultural trajectory of the nation for decades to come. The March on Washington was not inevitable. It was the product of courage, vision, and the tireless labor of countless individuals who refused to accept injustice. It was a testament to the power of collective action, disciplined strategy, and moral clarity. And as the first marchers began to converge on the National Mall that August day, the world was about to bear witness to a demonstration of unity, purpose, and hope that would never be forgotten.